And of course, as always, I want to thank TrickStop for allowing us to meet here. So let's see what the topic is for October, what you've selected, and I hope there's no excellent. This time there was no tie. So the topic for October will be, unlike this one, highly practical and down to earth, which is replacing pulling, a step-by-step guide to habit reversal training. So I will give you very practical steps and teach you how to implement habit reversal on your own. And now let's go to the Q&A. Oh, for people who are new and don't know and are thinking about joining the program, you have this coupon that you can use and you'll get a $60 discount for the first month. I always forget to read that, and even though it's right there staring me in the face. So let's go. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Okay, thank you for the compliments, but I really don't feel comfortable reading them all out loud. It just sounds a little self-absorbed. I've never been to any psychiatrist, and I'm facing this disorder for 11 years now. When I'm anxious or depressed, I feel satisfied when I pull my hair. But when I realize I pull too many hairs, I feel more depressed. I hate myself more when I saw my bald patches, and I feel ashamed socializing. Because of hair pulling, so I hate socializing because of hair pulling habit of mine. I'm from South Asia, so it may be that my English is not good. There's nothing wrong with your English. There's something wrong with my reading. My reason for depression is unemployment and financial liabilities. So for you, if you're still listening, I think joining the next webinar would actually be very useful because you'll get some tools to start changing on your own. But this is exactly what I was talking about towards the end of the webinar, how hair pulling actually validates and reinforces the problems that have caused it in the first place. Because indeed, it does provide relief from anxiety. And because sometimes pulling tends to focus us so much, it blocks out the external world. So it provides relief from depression as well. But then once you go back into the world, Tara Brach, one meditation teacher, she calls these things trances. She says that we really are very rarely present, that we go into trances of all sorts. And then over time, I've noticed that clients have started using this word, a pulling trance, which is like when you're completely immersed in pulling to the extent that you block out the entire world. And then you feel good, but then as soon as you come out of the trance, you feel horrible. So this is quite a common phenomenon. Then for you, the best thing to do is just come to the webinar in October and start implementing changes. Can you sum up the first picture about the mirror you said once again? About the mirror? Sorry, I think my brain just completely stopped. But if you mean the image, the chairs thing. So this is basically what we do. Like we are the chair, but what we look at is the photograph of ourselves, and then we say that's what we are. It's this mistaken identification that we always make. That was the point. How to maintain a stable, good self-image. I wouldn't talk about maintaining stable self-image because I don't think self-image can be terribly stable. It can be stable to a certain degree, but it has to change and evolve because life never stops. So, if you base your self-image on your career, but then someone else gets a promotion, you're going to feel bad about yourself. So you might need to revise your self-image. COVID has, for example, completely upset my lifestyle because prior to COVID, for about a decade, I very nicely balanced between different continents and lived in at least 3 different cities. And then I could arrange my life so that I never see snow and so that I get to travel a lot. And then COVID has really destroyed this. And this had a consequence on how I see myself because the way that I used to live was integral to my self-image. So I don't think the idea should be to create a self-image that's unchangeable. I would rather say that the goal should be that it's flexible. So instead of saying, I'll only be happy if I become the CEO of, I don't know, Pfizer. I think it's much better to say that to create, just give me a second. So what I want to say is that it's much better to create your self-image based on a value than a concrete goal. So I want to be a hard worker, for example, is a much better way to think of yourself than to say, I have to be the best employee in my company. Because sometimes we can work better, sometimes worse, and that doesn't always even depend on us. So our self-image has to have this degree of flexibility. The starting point is to actually see where you are now and how much you can do now, and then base it on that. But this is much more easily said than done, I have to say. So think of it as a long-term process, because our self-image starts its life when we're so little that we're basically babies. If you're interested in learning about how we start creating our self-image, try finding something on YouTube that will explain in layman's terms, or at least not sadistic terms, Lacan's idea of mirror stage, because that's where he explains sort of how that initial self-image is created. And then as we live, we add a lot of stuff to that. But most of all, and most importantly, is what I said in the end. It's how you relate to your self-image. Whether you will see it as like your role model to strive towards or a goal to attain. If it's a goal to attain, it's bound to frustrate you because, image is the map, it's never the territory. So you can't attain it. You can come close to it. You can be guided by it, but you can never attain it. So I think that's a much healthier way to look at it. Regarding remembering hairstyle and self-image before pulling, I do remember life before pulling quite well, but over the last few years, so this is someone sharing their experience, over the last few years, when I started pulling and did it more and more, I went from having a few bald spots covered up by a bun to being almost completely bald. Over the past few years, I've watched my self-image shrink to include more and more hiding of myself, to the point where now I only can wear a hat at all times. I've certainly noticed myself shifting my image over the last 6 years. And notice how your experience here illustrates my point also that I made towards the end, which is that the more shame there is, the more hiding there is. And then when you hide it, there's basically no accountability for your self-image. So basically you cement pulling by hiding it so well. Paradoxically, the goal would be to slowly open up and return to the world, to just kind of break through the shame. Because once you break through the shame, then you'll find a lot more options to choose from. But thank you for sharing this. I think this is a very good example. Boils basically were basically the cause of my hair pulling. I'd feel a bump and immediately start to pull any hair around it. I assume as a way to prevent the pain I experienced. I haven't had a boil in 7+ years, but the memory of that pain still haunts me. I have an appointment to make, so I have to leave early. My first time, and I think it helped. Thank you. Also, this was your first time here. Well, welcome, and I hope you join us in October as well. I've started to practice the saying, no matter how much hair I pull, I deserve to enjoy today, and it has really helped. Yes, I think this is actually a very good approach. So this was not the topic of this webinar specifically, but this seems like a very compassionate thing to do. Instead of saying, I'll just judge myself endlessly, you say, okay, I did something I wasn't supposed to do, but it doesn't mean that I'm all bad. There's still so much good in life and in me. So I think that's a really good approach. In fact, I think that immediate reaction that people have once they stop pulling, so there's usually like a level of gratification or at least focus and calm. And then once they stop, what immediately happens is that they will feel guilty because they will start judging themselves, right? So look what you've done. Now you might as well pull everything else that's left and so on. And so when you judge yourself for pulling, you're actually adding fuel to the fire. You're just adding more and more and more and more frustration. But what you did here in this example is to actually take that frustration away. You've basically done something to alleviate your suffering instead of piling up more. So that's a very healthy approach. So that's a very good example to follow. Does trichotillomania always stem from low self-esteem or a sense of self-worth? I wouldn't say always, and I don't like to generalize. like I wouldn't say that there's like one rule for everyone, but it's almost impossible that hair pulling will not affect someone's self-esteem at a certain point. So it might not start there, but then what it does is it ends up generating low self-esteem, which then feeds into this. So however you enter into the cycle, you usually just end up in this cycle or a similar cycle. One of the ways in which we conceptualize hair pulling, if this discourse is not your way of looking at it, is as a form of self-soothing or a form of avoidance of difficult emotional experiences. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that stems from negative self-image. It can be something that helps you not process certain experiences so that you protect your self-image. That's also something that happens in many cases. This is sometimes difficult to relate to when a lot of your pulling is automatic. So you're not aware of your thoughts and emotions, and then it's very difficult to come up with the whole image. So just try kind of observing yourself. Ultimately, I think this goes for everything that I'm saying here and everything that anyone ever tells you, if they're in the field of mental health or coaching or anything like that. Give it a try in your personal experience. If it doesn't resonate, if you don't have evidence that that's the case, then discard the theory. Find another theory. I don't think we should look at any theory at all in this world as being the ultimate truth. Like if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It can sound very elegant and beautiful, but it doesn't work. That's just what it is. Do you find that a lot of your clients have problems with sexual intimacy due to their hair pulling and self-image issues? Yes, and not just sexual intimacy, but really intimacy of any sorts. Absolutely, yes. I don't know what else to add. If you have any specific question, I would be happy to answer it. But yes, this is quite common. In fact, there's one of the things that when I don't usually spend a lot of time browsing through Reddit and these forums because I don't know, I'm just not a social media kind of person. But when I do, sometimes when clients send me links to look at, I see that one of the pulling sites that people never mention is the pubic area. And this is actually not rare at all. People quite frequently pull in this area. And this is particularly troubling because, as you said, it causes problems then with intimacy specifically. It tends to have devastating effects on their self-esteem, but at the same time, it's the easiest form of pulling to hide. So it's, it remains that kind of private sphere because that, pubic hair is really not a subject of most of the conversations that people have. So it tends to go unnoticed for a very long time. And it's almost like a parallel universe that it exists in. I completed a 9-month of DBT and connected with all you said. The label borderline scared me at first to try, but so glad I did. Well, any kind of diagnosis, like the whole DSM really is just a bunch of labels. But then again, because people take self-image and language literally, they think that borderline personality disorder is something like the plague or COVID. It's not, it's just a name that we give to certain combinations of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. I think if the label is useful, and from what you said, according to, if you've done DBT, I guess a lot of this would be familiar to you as well. If the label is useful, go with it. But I would never identify myself with the label. Especially with something, borderline personality disorder carries a lot of stigma with it. So I don't think it's useful to think of ourselves as having that, as being that. I would just think of it as just one way to phrase some of the experiences that we have. I don't think we need to pile more stigma and more shame on top of each other. Sorry, one second, I skipped a question accidentally. I have a theory why it's not working to be on that app and focusing on the pulling, because what we focus on grows. The more I focus on when I pull, the more I'm triggered to pull. However, focusing on what's good in my life has lessened my pulling triggers. I think that makes sense to an extent, but at the same time, if you focus only on the good in your life, that is avoidance, because life is both good and bad, so we should be able to accept it. And in terms of the app, so by the way, like if there are people who are not in the program, you can just download and use the app. It's not tied to the program in any way. It's free and we don't get to see your data. So it's all private and yours. So the way that I use the app with clients, at least, is to have them use the app for the first 2 weeks, because this is when we do awareness training as part of the habit reversal process, which is what comes first in the program. And this is very useful because we get to learn about triggers, thoughts, emotions. We learn about how the whole process takes place. We assess how much of it is focused, how much of it is automatic. So what I like to do is use the app for 2 weeks. And then after those 2 weeks, we assess whether or not it makes sense to continue using the app. For some people, it doesn't, because we really learn enough. For others, it does make sense, so then they continue. And then other people might go back to the app at a certain point. If we identify a particularly stubborn form of pulling, then app will help us get the data. I'm not married to the app in any way. So I think when it's useful, we use it. When it's not useful, we don't use it. So that's my own. As you can see, I have a very pragmatic approach to these things, because no matter how much I like certain tools, I mean, the app is, I don't have an opinion either way, but there are some techniques in the program that I truly deeply love, like mindfulness or cognitive diffusion. And some people like them, some people don't. Like, I will never stop it. I don't like it. But when people actually do genuinely implement them and try them out for a couple of weeks and see that they don't work for them, oh, well, we'll just toss them aside. Because the ultimate goal is not for you to master any particular technique. The goal is to pull less. So that's what we work on. I don't pull it out from the root. I break pieces off in different places. Does this define a different type of anxiety or self-image? So in and of itself, this doesn't have any implications that I could just give you just right off the bat. We'd have to talk about that a little bit and see why and how and what you do. I think it can be helpful in the sense that maybe the hair loss wouldn't be as visible as it is when you pull out the whole hair. And I think it maybe gives you more flexibility in terms of how to keep your hair from, being seen as damaged. And this is a double-edged blade, as things often are, because on one hand, the consequences are not as bad, but on the other hand, if you can hide it, you're probably not that motivated to change immediately. So it's a matter of seeing, what way you want to look at it. But there are many forms of pulling. So the only important distinction in pulling that clinically always makes a difference is whether or not pulling is focused or automatic. Because when we do habit reversal training, we will implement different techniques for these two types, right? And we want most of it to be focused, or at least for you to be aware of it, because it makes our life easier. But these things, like whether or not you break it off in half, or do you pull out the root, or do you play with the root afterwards, or do you eat the hair or not eat the hair, or do you save the hair somewhere or throw it away? Like, there are many different things that people do. These have significance in some cases. I would say that they always have meaning, but for therapy, they don't always have use, but sometimes they do. And we investigate that as well, but that really is on case-by-case basis. I don't like to sort of shove one idea down everyone's throat, because sometimes it just doesn't work for people. For example, there are clients whose pleasure, like the soothing and the gratifying effect of pulling, is entirely in what happens after they pull. So once they pull the hair out, they actually get the pleasure for playing with the root, or looking at the root, or touching their lips. This is something that's quite common, or chewing the root, or just biting it off. So this is where the center of the pleasure is. But for others, it's the act of pulling out. This is also sometimes an important distinction to make when we plan interventions. Because if this sensory aspect is important, that tells us what kinds of competing responses we will choose for you. I don't pull for 11 weeks now, but I can't make goals. Instead, I look at how long I don't need to hoover, cleanliness in order, and enjoy. Being patient with myself is very useful. Every day is new. Yeah, I don't think it's useful to set any firm goals. This is, I don't know why, but this is a very common strategy that people come to therapy with. And they say, like, I have to stop pulling, by 50% by Friday. I don't think that's useful. I usually tell people, if you want to have a very precise goal, just set it at 10%. Even that, I think, is sometimes ambitious, but it depends, I guess, from the client. But if it's 10%, that means in 2.5 months, it'll be 0%. But overall, I think every week is different and every day is different. It carries different stresses, different situations that we have to deal with. Some we can predict and then we can plan these things, but life has a way of surprising us. So if we make ambitious plans and then fail, it'll just add to our frustration. That's the whole trouble with it. Is there a cure to stop once and for all? Is hair pulling caused by a chemical imbalance? Do meds help, or is it more behavioral therapy? So, most kinds of therapy, psychotherapy, will help you more than meds. Overall, that's one thing that research agrees on, is that psychotherapy is more effective than the medication, but there are meds that can help, although how much, it's really depending on what study you look at. Some antidepressants can help, although obviously you have to have a psychiatrist to prescribe them to you. And it's no longer a supplement, I don't know how they call it now, but NAC helps some people. But it helps about 50% of the people and helps them reduce their pulling by about half. So that's how much it helps. In terms of, is it a chemical imbalance? I don't like to blame chemical imbalances for things, because whatever we do, whatever habit we have, whatever problem we have, even now as I'm speaking, all of that affects our brain chemistry. So it's like a two-way street. Your behaviors will affect your brain will affect your behaviors. So it's like a cycle, more than one directly causing the other. This is because I have a pragmatic approach. There are certain therapists that will tell you chemical imbalance is garbage, and then there are psychiatrists who will tell you psychology is garbage. And in reality, we do have a lot of research, specifically all the mindfulness research that there is out there, will tell you that this is a two-way street, that our behaviors not only affect our brain chemistry, but they actually shape our brain, and vice versa. Our brain will affect our behaviors. So I would just see it as a cycle, kind of. So if you can attack it from both sides, that's also a thing to do. Is there a cure to stop once and for all? I would say yes, but I would also caution you about one thing. I think people can stop pulling, and they do, but I think the urge to pull is not necessarily something that you can eliminate, nor something that's necessarily a problem. And because we've been at this for 2 hours almost now, if you're interested in this topic, go to our YouTube channel and find the webinar that we have on urges a couple of months back, because the whole webinar talks about this, that I think the urge can be quite useful for us to understand our own psyche. It's like an alarm, not necessarily something to get rid of. But in terms of behaviors, sure. Pulling is stubborn, but it's not stronger than you. So yes. How can we work with you? I'm already a member, and can you change therapists? So you can change therapists, but at this very point, I don't think they would change you to me. Actually, I'm quite certain they wouldn't, since my workload is like at 99% at this point. But if there is something that you particularly resonated with from this webinar, tell your therapist about this. And if there's something that you think that they don't understand, tell them to talk to me. So since I'm the clinical lead in the company, every therapist can reach out to me if they need any help, and they often do. And so in that sense, like, you have me indirectly already. And if there's anything that you're not happy with about your therapist, please tell them. So, and be as honest as you possibly can. Every therapist who's worth their salt should be able to hear whatever feedback you have for them, because you should be honest. It's in your best interest, and they should know better than to take it personally. So in that sense, if there's something that doesn't work with your therapist, talk to them about it and have them change strategies. If that doesn't work out, you can change therapists. All you need to do is email our support and then tell them, and then they will reassign you to someone else. You can send, oh, I just answered in public, sorry. So that's wasn't. Why is it so gratifying, though, to sit and do it? Is that chemically based, or is it something else? So my answer to the chemical thing would be yes and no. Yes, both. Like I said, everything we do really is chemically based. I think it's a very complex question that you're asking in terms of why. Basically, what you're telling me is, what you're asking me is, why is pulling gratifying and not something else? I can ask the same thing of a lot of things. So, for example, my sister loves to eat chocolate. I don't in particular. So that doesn't really, but then again, give me a stinky piece of cheese and I will be very gratified. So why is it that she's gratified by chocolate and I'm by cheese? Experience, different ways in which we lived. For example, my sister, who apparently I should text because she keeps coming to my mind for the last 15 minutes. So my sister, for example, runs marathons, and she's about to run the New York Marathon, which, from my point of view, that's just masochistic. I don't really understand why anyone would do that to themselves. But then again, I go on 2-week or 3-week mindfulness retreats and I meditate 10 hours a day, and I think she would go crazy if she did that. So something gratifies me doesn't gratify her. There's a lot. What I'm saying is that our personal experiences and these little specific events that have happened to us, even chance sometimes, will shape our experience. There are some situations where we can, when I work with clients, where we can trace back pulling to, let's say, seeing your parents pull. Or just this week, one of my clients told me that they started pulling when they saw someone twirl their hair in school. And then they tried doing that themselves and they accidentally pulled the hair and just felt this flash of pleasure, and the connection was born. And if you think about it, that is chance to a certain extent. Like, we can trace it back logically, it all makes sense. But if in that moment the client looked elsewhere, something else might have happened. But either way, so let me just make this very clear. If the need that pulling satisfies is not a pathological need, there's nothing wrong about needing to self-soothe. There's nothing wrong about needing to feel calm. There's nothing wrong even with needing to focus and zone out from time to time. The trouble with pulling is not that it's the desire that's wrong, it's that the act is harmful. So, for example, my way of self-soothing is to do mindfulness, and I love it. It's amazing. It causes no side effects, but it works for me. It soothes me. In the beginning, it didn't, but I took it as a challenge, and then after a while, it became that for me. So, for example, I find myself, so it's not like every time I'm upset, I sit and meditate. That's not how it works. I have my set time for meditation, but I will catch myself that if I'm frustrated by something, like during the day, that I will automatically just go back and start observing my breath, for example. And that really soothes me. So you can find other ways to soothe yourself. And there's also one phenomenon, for example, that I've observed, is that if people struggle with 2 types of BFRBs, let's say picking and pulling, then as they work on pulling, picking sometimes increases. Or people who tend to have a troubled relationship with food, let's say in the most general terms. And then when they have their pulling under control, they will start eating more, because basically both of these will serve as means of emotional regulation. And I guess sometimes people are happy with that kind of change, and other times we have to find different ways to cope with it. In your experience, what are the most common comorbidities with hair pulling, or can it be just isolated, connected with generalized anxiety and so on? So hair pulling can absolutely be like a standalone condition. So you don't necessarily have to have any other mental health issue other than hair pulling. The most common comorbidities, I can tell you, my experience basically corresponds to all the studies that I've seen, which is that the first most common comorbidity in about 34-35% of cases, if I remember the numbers well, are other BFRBs. So skin picking, nail biting, cheek biting, stuff like that. And then the second one would be anxiety disorders as like an umbrella term. So generalized anxiety, social anxiety, and things like that. And then you will have things like OCD. And then lower down the list would be some chronic conditions like borderline personality disorder, for example, or even traumatic events, although that is exceedingly rare. Overall, it would be inaccurate to say that trauma causes pulling. But it does happen. Let's say it's in top 10 maybe. So those would be the most common ones. In general, wherever you see anxiety, that's where you can find connections with pulling. And there's something else that pulling is very often associated with, but it's not a clinical condition, so no one kind of thinks of it that way, which is perfectionism. That's incredibly common. Meditation gives me CPTSD flashbacks, so I tried yoga. It's my sort of meditation. It works great. Any tips if someone thinks meditation is too strong? So I don't have, so the book is there. I don't think it's worth getting up, but if you want, email me and then I'll send you a reference. So there are specific ways in which people who struggle with PTSD can learn to meditate. So in fact, meditation is used in treatment of PTSD. It suggests that it has to be introduced in a very slow, deliberate, intentional, and specific way. In fact, like if you can find a teacher who is also a psychologist, or even better, Buddhist monks. Buddhist psychology is very complex and it's like 4,000 years old. So they have a lot of experience with what they do. And they will teach people for free. So for example, they can teach you. But if yoga works for you, then stick with yoga. So it's not like, I mean, the fact that I talk about mindfulness a lot is because I practice it and I teach it, and it's something that I really like. So it's something that I find fulfilling, but not everyone has to, you know. People are allowed to be wrong, let's say. Just kidding. But yeah, if yoga works for you, that's excellent. So just stick with yoga. There's really no need to do that. But yeah, I find that people who have PTSD, we have to be very careful about how we implement mindfulness. I've done it in the past, it just requires effort. The second, people who have bipolar disorder also should be very cautious about meditation. People who have psychotic disorders of any kind should be very cautious with meditation as well. Not that it's impossible, it's just that you need to have a qualified teacher who knows what the hell they're doing. And also people who are extremely anxious. So meditation is absolutely a good way to regulate anxiety long term. But what happens is this kind of bouncing effect that once you start relaxing, your body feels like it's losing control. And then what it does is that instead of relaxing, it tenses up even more. So when you try to immediately just jump into meditation and you're very anxious, it tends to make you more anxious. So you just modify the approach. But specifically when it comes to PTSD, it is absolutely necessary to be done in a very specific way. There are two books that I know of that talk about PTSD and mindfulness. One is the one that I mentioned on the shelf, and the other one is, I don't know, somewhere, I think in Budapest. But either way, I maybe have a copy of it on my Kindle, so I can send you the references if you're interested. What about ADHD? Any links? Yeah, that's also a common comorbidity. Not something that I've seen in studies, but something that I've definitely seen with my clients. And what they share, what they have in common is impulse control issues. So this is a very complicated combination. And another thing is that ADHD medication seems to have like double effect. So sometimes it will actually reduce pulling, but then when the effect wears off, like in the evening, for example, pulling tends to come back. So you also have to be very careful with that if you've noticed any effects. Can you discuss the association between perfectionism and hair pulling, please? So we have a whole webinar on the topic. So there's like an hour and a half of me going on and on in different details and explaining about different thought patterns and how that affects pulling. So you can go to YouTube and find our webinar. We can do the webinar again if there's enough interest. I can add it to the list for next time because there's a lot of materials that I didn't include in the old ones. Are there any new medications that can help other than antidepressants? So there are some studies that have tested like mood stabilizers or even antipsychotic medications, but I don't think, so these studies are first of all very small, so it's hard to generalize. And second of all, I'm finding it very hard that a psychiatrist would prescribe either a mood stabilizer or an antipsychotic for hair pulling because these medications have very serious side effects and you can't just, like antidepressants are relatively safe, whereas neither of these are, especially mood stabilizers. They can be quite complicated to start and then stop taking. So I doubt that anyone would actually prescribe you any of these. In terms of what the FDA has approved, no. That is a very clear no. It would be off-label use anyway. Okay, so I think this is a good, I see that there are a few questions. If there are some questions that I accidentally skipped over, I don't click that the answers are, I don't click that I've answered your questions, because then your names pop up in public and I don't want to do that. So this way you're all anonymous. If I accidentally skipped your question, email it please to me, and I will try to answer it by the end of the week, so by Friday. Thank you so much for sticking around for so long and for listening to me. I hope to see you in October. And well, I'm going to drink about a gallon of water now. So have a pleasant evening.